Morning, everyone. Thank you for not disappearing. I feel quite exhausted having watched those extraordinary, extraordinary people. There we go. Oops. Thank you. So we're just getting set up here. And then my panel is going to arrive. Do you think Ada will ever dance like that? Yes, that's what I think too. I think artificial intelligence will build that kind of muscle and inspiration, and in a couple of years' time we will have a dancing Ada here, not just talking. Hi everyone, thank you so much.
Hello.
Hi Eric, how are you?
I'm good, Fiametta.
Good morning. My name is Fiametta Rocco and I am the culture correspondent of The Economist in London. And we are going to be talking about mentoring, particularly about how to mentor to really have an impact. I'm sure Ada had many mentors, but I also wonder, in addition to be a dancer, do you think she'd also ever be a mentor? Now there's a thought. So my fellow panelists this morning are all coincidentally involved in the world of music and music education. Gail Heading is director of Berklee Abu Dhabi, which is here to develop creative capacities in the region. Well, Berklee certainly needed all the creative capacity it could muster. It opened here on the 1st of March 2020. 2 weeks later, the pandemic hit, and it was sink or swim, and lucky for us, they swam. On my right is Erica Love, Director of Culture Centre in Birmingham, an astonishing city in Britain with a very rich tradition and hinterland around music and music education. And Eric Wainaina, my fellow Kenyan. What can I say? Eric is a singer-songwriter. He's a hero to many, particularly in Kenya. He's tireless in the efforts he makes through musical theatre and through sport to help young Kenyans break the cycle of poverty. He's a legend. We heard yesterday from Trevor Noah. I know Tim mentioned Trevor Noah because I think there are a lot of us who heard him speak can't really forget what it was like to hear him. But we heard from him in particular about the people who can make a difference in a young life, the people who teach you about hard work, the people who believe in you, the people who believe, as Trevor Noah's mother did, in helping you pursue your passion to find your purpose, and through that, peace and what he called the pool of pleasure. So I want to start with a quick round to all three of you. Who made that crucial difference in your life?
Well, that must be my piano teacher, actually. She made a huge difference because rather than impose a curriculum, she let me play and fall in love with music and playing with it. And that, here I am now working for a music institution. So, yeah.
Eric, how about you?
I think the person who inspired me most, the mentor, was my mother. Growing up,
Kenyan mothers are something
Kenyan
else.
mothers are something else. But every Sunday and over the course of the month of December, she'd make sure there was no housekeeper, no house helper. And I said to her, Mother, Mom, why are you putting me through this torture? And she said, because when you go to America as a student, I don't want you to marry the first woman who makes you a chapati. Ironically, and the other great mentor in my life is my wife, and they'd be shocked to be in the same group, my wife and my mother. But when we first started dating, for the first 6 months, she said to me that she didn't cook. So I cooked for her every time she came over. Then, 6 months in a day, she makes this wonderful meal, and they're like, I thought you said you didn't cook. And she said, well, I didn't want it to define our relationship. So that's kind of guided our relationship ever since. And so those two women have been wonderful mentors in my life.
What a wonderful story. Erica, how about you?
I was really thinking about this question, and And unlike you two, it's actually my daughter. How can you do anything other than learn as you start to grow as a mum and to find out about yourself, your values, your purpose? And I would say now she's an adult, she is my biggest champion and also my biggest protagonist.
Great, what a daughter. I have a daughter too, and they are quite something. So, Gail, I want to start with you. You are the director of a high-profile organisation in the UAE. Now, this is a rich country with a very small population. Many of them are well-connected. Everyone here is fantastically well looked after. What does mentoring really mean in a country like this? And how does Berkeley in Abu Dhabi craft mentoring schemes that go beyond just work experience for family and friends?
I think the key is to start by acknowledging the fact that the most effective mentoring happens when you can really tailor the experience. And the mentees need to have clear expectations of what they're going to be getting, and the mentors need to know what they need to provide as well. And particularly here, we've developed a program called Performance, Artistry, and Leadership. It's a wonderful program that actually is closer to mentoring than it is academic in many ways, because it's experiential. We bring experts in the industry that spend time with each one of the students and learn through experiential learning. And there's a relationship that builds between, in this case, the mentor and the mentee. One that very often goes beyond the sort of hard skills that they're learning, whether it's music production, songwriting, or learning about the business. Because ultimately what it should be about is helping these young, developing artists become great in the industry and have a pathway. And a lot of it is not something that's in the textbooks necessarily. It's things that get transmitted, such as, how do you listen? How do you analyze? How do you hold yourself in a room with other people, creating together? And that can only happen being in the room and having a deep connection with the teacher or the mentor in this case. So particularly here, we started with something like Pearl, the Performance and Artistry and Leadership program. But we also draw from the experience that we have in other mentoring schemes across Berkeley. And one of the things that is common to them is that there's always an attention to pairing the right mentor with the right mentee. And because ultimately it is about the relationship that they build together and the opportunities that grow from that. And I liked what you were mentioning earlier, because we all often think that mentoring happens from the mentor towards the mentee, but there's also a relationship, reverse mentoring it's called, but when it happens in both ways, it's that more meaningful because the bond becomes stronger. So we're always looking at how we can make sure that happens, that the learning happens both ways. And when that takes place, it becomes that more meaningful.
And how do your mentees find you? Is it a program that they apply for? How do you choose them? What are the sort of numbers that we're talking about? Because scaling is something that I want to talk about later on. But
right. In particular, the Pearl program is application-based. We search for talent across the region. People apply, and there's a process, and then we essentially choose the right people in any given period. Across other mentoring schemes, it's a bit different, because we've got mentoring as well for students that are entering college and helping them go through that, as well as mentoring programs like the mentoring network for after college, and pairing them with people outside of the industry. So for each one of them, it's different. Yeah.
Eric, I want to turn to you now. You run a very effective organization in Britain, Culture Central. And it would be easy to say, Britain is a rich country. It used to be a rich European country, but it's now just a rich country. But these things are all relative, and there are parts of Britain, the reality is, particularly now as the cost of living crisis bites, where it's going to be ever more relative. Culture Central is an organisation that works in some of Britain's poorest areas. What happened to your organisation during the pandemic, and what are the wider lessons that can be drawn from that, not just for the next pandemic, but across the whole time till then?
Yeah, and I think where we live and work it's been a really challenging time for COVID. I run a development organisation for the cultural sector. When I started, it was just before the pandemic, and I was just finding my feet, which was interesting. And then the pandemic hit, and obviously in the UK, that meant that the majority of arts and cultural organisations and venues, and therefore freelancers and those who worked in it, had to basically stop work, either go on furlough, close the doors, and that was like that off and on for about 18 months. That meant that huge amounts of redundancies, or say people not working. What we did was we convened the West Midlands Culture Response Unit as a collective response to the pandemic. So we brought together all of the arts and cultural organisations in the region to really find ways that we could ensure we were visible and viable, and to support each other through that process. I think what we found, and this is where the mentoring scheme, we found a collective responsibility together to know that this was our way of having to make sure that arts and culture was still in existence, and we could still do that post-pandemic. It's still very challenging now with the cost of living, and I think that you've just directed to that we are facing yet another crisis, and I think the important thing that we need to do, and places like this are really exciting for that, is to make sure we're working together, collaboratively, collectively, making the case for the value of arts and culture in our communities and how they serve the people who are actually most deprived in those places.
And what's the biggest lesson you took looking forward from that you want to carry on with it?
Our biggest lesson?
From the pandemic, for that particular work that you do?
To make sure that you are open, transparent, authentic, and that you are working with everyone, no hierarchies, that there is parity across that place. And that collaboration really is the thing that I've learned the most out of it, and the importance of it. I think the value that we found as an organisation and organisations that exist within our region has been that connectivity. Also, massive change, we saw through that. In the UK, we had the Black Lives Matter movement, and that resulted in a huge amount of collaboration around inclusivity and equity.
Eric, a lot of that might resonate, but to lots of people that you work with, it seems perhaps slightly alien concept. I mean, more than half the world's population lives on less than $10 a day. I know you believe mentoring is one of the key things to help young people break out of the cycle of poverty, as you call it. What steps need to be taken to really make this work? And tell us in some detail about it, because you've worked musical theatre, you've worked with sport, and what lessons do you think Kenyans have for the rest of the world?
Well, I think particularly with us, the only barrier to entry should be talent. If you can do a thing, you should be in a program. See, the moment we decide that only kids or only people who can pay for stuff can be in a program, we've already decided just how good we're going to be. If you look at, I was listening to this documentary once. The great football nation of Brazil was a terrible football nation until about 1910. Why? Because they only let rich kids play. Suddenly they opened it up, and they've become the soccer powerhouse that we know them to be. In Kenya, we've got athletes who literally, after they leave high school, will find a shack on the long-distance sort of running track, right? And join this horde of people every day, and we're going to run without shoes, and we're just for 2 years until someone discovers you and says, Gail, we're going to take you on, right? And because of that, Kenya is this huge long-distance powerhouse. But if we only said, look, it's got to be the kids with the shoes, It's got to be the kids who can speak perfect English, you know, then we wouldn't be anywhere. So for me, one of the things that just has to be true is that the only thing you have to exhibit is talent. If you can pay, pay. If you can't, we'll pay for you.
How have you made that work?
So far, our programs have run through pretty much through benefactors.
Tell us a bit about your programs, because I don't know that everybody here will be familiar with what you do.
There's two programs that are particularly relevant to this. So about 5 years ago, I started a thing called the Nairobi Musical Theatre Initiative. I started this because, as someone who's loved musical theatre for a long time, I got to a point where if someone had said to me, let's have a production of Grease, I was going to have to slit my wrists. I said, like, come on, I love Grease, I love Seraphine, I love all those musicals, right? But we've got all these wonderful stories from Kenya that need to be told. And so I'd been writing this musical. I'd had a dramaturg from Sundance. Dramaturgs are script editors who kind of walk you through the process of writing your musical. And I said to her, Roberta, it's been 3 grueling years. First thing, someone's got to give me an honorary master's. I'll take it from Berkeley, that's all right. But then also, would you come and spend some time with Kenyan thespians and take us through this process of writing musicals? And the first time she was coming to Kenya, she was actually coming to NYU Abu Dhabi, I think it was 2016, and it wasn't going to cost anything to bring her to Nairobi. And so she came and we spent this time in a room stimulating ideas with a bunch of other thespians. And we've kept that going through sort of fundraising from individual benefactors. My wife and I have put some money into the process as well. But as we sort of develop these musicals, sort of beyond first and second draft, where a lot of them are, now we start asking ourselves, how do we make this commercially viable productions? And that's the next phase. The other thing that we're doing is that during the pandemic, I inherited a table tennis team from one of the low-income areas in Nairobi. And what's shocking about these kids, I mean, the kids age from between 7 to about 16. I mean, 3 of our kids play for Kenya, for Kenya's youth team, you know. But if you had just met them, they're 3 kids from a really rough neighborhood in Nairobi, and had they not been given the opportunity, we would never have seen this. So one of the things we've done is because, take for example, there's so many wonderful Kenyan athletes who are out there, but one of the things that has hampered us from becoming sort of bigger global brands than they have been, right, is maybe their inability so far to express themselves in a particular way and to represent brands in a particular way, right? And so we took some of these kids and said, we're going to put you in great schools. We're going to put you in great schools, learn how to speak the language, learn how to represent yourself, learn how to represent the world that you live in, etc., to help you break out of this fate, this thing that fate has handed you, right? So now we've got kids that we're trying to put through high school, trying to get them the best education possible.
How many are we talking about?
Right now we've got 16, but the numbers are set to grow.
Because the reason I ask you that is about scale. You know, the luck that one talented person will meet one talented mentor is fantastic, but it doesn't help a whole population. One of the most impressive mentoring schemes I've ever come across is Rolex Arts Mentoring. In fact, Sir David Ajay, who will be here tomorrow, has been one of the mentors there. But you know, they take on one person for 2 years. It's very slow, it's incredibly expensive, it's beautifully done, and it's very, 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 very important. But it really only helps a handful of people. So how do we scale up? When we've got so many young people, how do you scale up?
I mean, there's different ways to do that. Obviously, that's the, you know, inherently mentoring is very much hinged in the relationship between the mentor and the mentee. So if you know, aside of doing that, the only other option is group mentoring. And when you do that, obviously, you're losing some of that tailoring that happens when two people are working together. But it's also very effective, especially when you combine group mentoring and peer mentoring, where there is a particular mentor working with the group of students in this case, and then making sure that within that group they're paired with each other. I insist on the fact that very often we think about mentoring from the top down, and there's so much to be gained when it happens from the bottom up or among individuals that are in the same situation. Because ultimately it is about that human connection and going through the experience of trespassing whatever challenge is happening. Effective mentoring happens when you have a sense of belonging, when you have a sense of recognition. So anything that we can do that leads to that is ultimately making mentoring even more effective. So to your question, yes, I believe it's combining all these different types of mentoring in schemes that allow us to reach larger groups of people. Of course, it's never as effective as one-on-one, right? It's effective in different ways, I guess. Yeah.
Eric, how would it work in somewhere like Kenya? How would it work in a poor country where 50% of the population will be under the age of 15? How does scaling up, how could that work?
It's a fascinating question. Well, I think, first of all, we're better than we think we are. And in a lot of situations, and I've decided to get off my high horse and stop sort of looking at maybe even, let's say, government institutions that have in the past failed us, and just be there like, look, I see there's a couple of people in here who have their hearts in the right place. And so I think the first thing is sort of a mind shift on our part, the people who are sort of the practitioners that are working this every single day, to be there like, look, okay, I believe the best in you, right? I'm gonna get into the minds with you, and we're gonna make this thing work. As opposed to being there like, you guys don't know what you're doing, we're the guys who know what we're doing, and so I definitely think forming genuine partnerships, where that's not just a buzzword, it's like, look, because anytime we walk into a situation, like I've taught for many years in my life, you walk into a classroom situation, and especially now, I'm teaching kids who are like 16, 17, and you walk into a class situation and they know a lot. And in many ways, they might know as much as you do, And so, you would attest to this as well, Gael,
Yes.
And I think part of the thing is walking into a situation being there like, how can we share? What do you know that I can benefit? What can I tell you, you know what I mean? And I think that there has been a tendency to we come from very punitive cultures as well, Right now, I'm in a
what way?
It's been top down for the longest time, right? My wife always says, where will we learn democracy? Where will we learn democracy? Where, at the home, it's the father's word that's the last word. In class, it's the teacher's word that's the last word. In church or in your religious institution, it's whoever's up at the pulpit who's got the last word, No one ever gets to, after a church sermon, be there like, excuse me, pastor, I have a question about that thing you said. No one ever gets to do that, right? And so, but it's got to be a thing where we're just genuinely open to being challenged, As a parent of kids who know a shocking amount, it's ridiculous what our kids know, right? Just being in a conversation with our kids, and just genuinely hearing what they have to say, and genuinely being there like, I don't understand what you're saying, or pushing back, or letting them push back, and not coming back with, I'm the father and this, or my wife being like, I'm the mother and this is how thing is going to go, So how do we expand it? Definitely going to situations and being ready to participate and not dictate. Tools, not rules, for sure.
Pretty good ones. How do we measure the impact of mentoring? It can be good-hearted, it can be generous, it can be friendly, it can be kind, but some of it will be more effective than others. So is it, do you measure it in thank you letters? Do you measure it in jobs gained? Are there KPIs, key performance indicators? If measurement is going to be a tool for doing mentoring better, how does measurement work?
I think it's an interesting dynamic around measuring mentoring, because there are going to be definite places where it is just about personal benefit and individual learning, and capturing that is always a challenge. It's anecdotal, it's subjective. But I think what we found is having a really kind of structured evaluation framework around capturing where you started, where you've got to, and also feedback from the mentor as well. And we hold regular, as part of our mentoring program, sort of regular feedback sessions from everybody. I don't know if you can ever measure a job. Is that what people are after if they're mentoring? But what we always do is ask that the mentoring process is action focused. So, for example, at the end of a session, you have, as a mentee, you have made an action that you are going to achieve, and you are going to do that ready for the next session, for example. And I think, have you achieved it? Have you got there? Have you got what you wanted out of it? What's also really interesting, though, is how do you know what you want from it in the first place? So we've been commissioned to deliver a mentoring program for freelancers specifically excluded from work in the sector, or usually excluded from work in the sector. And rather than just straight in with a mentee, we commissioned an arts organisation in Birmingham to work with them on life story mapping, which took them through their dreams, their ambitions and their goals in life, so they could start that process to think about why they really wanted to be in the programme or to be a freelancer in the sector and to work. Was it to feed their family? Was it to be an artistic director? Was it to be a curator, producer? Or was it just to enjoy the work and the art that they created? Now when we get to the end of the mentoring sessions, that is what we're going to go, have you moved steps towards getting to where your goals were as part of that process?
Quite interesting. Do you have measurement criteria that you use?
Yeah, for instance, the mentoring that happens for students that enter college, a good measure of it is, how that peer mentoring or the staff mentoring that we have as well affects their dropout rate, how it affects their wanting to stay in the institution and also succeed through it. As you know, when you're a student and you come in, it's a very special moment in life. You're discovering what you want to do. You're discovering what you want to become, right? So there's a lot of doubt that comes through that as well. So a good way to measure it is beyond the things that you're mentioning about the satisfaction and are they achieving their goals. One of those easy metrics is, are they how's the dropout rate being affected when a mentoring program is in place. I think it's a very interesting question, because it's easy to count. When we're talking about KPIs, we count how much money came in, or how many people came through the door, that type of situation. But when we're talking about social impact and it's something that it's still being developed throughout institutions in the world. How do we measure that? And the answer tends to be, in each case, it's going to be different, and it has to be different, because ultimately, again, in the particular case of mentoring, most effective mentoring happens in a tailored way, when you really understand what the person needs and you're able to provide them those tools, like you were mentioning. And so in each case, it's going to be different. So measuring that, obviously, is going to be largely different from one program to the other, inevitably.
So I want to ask you all about the ethics and morality in mentoring. In what ways is it a public good? In what ways is it not? In what ways is there a power imbalance between mentor and mentee? I'll give you a small personal example. I've worked for The Economist since my daughter was a year old. She's now 26. And I've always had in my office an extra desk and an extra computer terminal. So For many years, I used to offer a week's work experience to young people. I don't believe in shadowing people at work. It's like sort of learning to cook by watching somebody do a demonstration. It just doesn't work at all. But I would take one person at a time, and with my extra desk and my extra computer terminal, I'd put them to work. We would work on the weekly paper, bringing out The Economist. Each one of them came to editorial meetings. They helped choose photographs. We did the page makeup. They did loads of proofreading, and then at the end of the time, they had to write all the captions. But The Economist at that time had no policy of having a mentoring program. I was a sort of rogue operator, if you want. And most of the kids who came because they were children of colleagues or they were friends of my daughters. And over the years, I must have had probably about 200 of them. Now, they weren't poor. Most of them were privately educated. Most of them were middle class. Most of them were white. I feel slightly embarrassed about it now because we've learnt so much when we hear about barriers to entry, about gatekeepers, about the things that you were talking about. This kind of friendly offering of a helping hand has a lot of those darker characteristics if you really look at it. So was what I did, for all its good intentions, somewhat immoral? And this is the important question, but how do we learn from this and do mentoring better? Because every individual can make a difference. And if every individual can make a difference better, then we might take a real leap forward in what we're thinking. What do you think, Cam?
I cannot agree anymore. I think ultimately it's also about mentality and culture, right? If I look back at some of my personal experiences, initially as a mentee, you would walk into a recording studio and at times, and this is not that long ago, at times there was, engineers would put sheets over stuff to cover and not show you what they're doing, or if you would want to take a picture of whatever they were doing in the studio, they'd be reticent to that. And I think there's been a huge shift from those times till now, and probably part of it has a lot to do with the fact that there's a democratization of information. So suddenly, being that gatekeeper of information is less possible. And for me, where that takes it takes it away from, I know how to do this, and I'm the one in power, and if you want to get through the door, you have to come through me, and these are my rules, versus, oh, you know as much as I do in the technical side of things. So, and at some point you might become my competition. So I think a lot of people have acknowledged that and realized that closing themselves and being very selective and being gatekeepers is not the way to go. And there's a shift. I mean, when we, talking about mentoring maybe 15, 20, 30 years ago, you would go and find people that would want to do it, and it wasn't that easy. And these days, for instance, with our programs, we've got many, many alumni that are like, we want to be part of this. How can I give back? How can I, And I think part of it comes from the realization that there's a lot to be gained as well with giving back. And of course, if you do it with people that are less privileged, there's even more to be gained because they have more, they need even more, right? So I do think that there's a shift. More and more people are opening to sharing. And also the realization that it's, like I said, it's not about just, here's how you do it, but absorbing some of these other things that are, in the realm of soft skills. And that, we were discussing it earlier, it only happens when you're in the room with the person, when you're in contact with what they're doing. And there needs to be a balance, like you said. It can't be just, I'm watching you cook, and I'm not getting any out of it. But it also shouldn't be a very structured thing where, you meet at this time, and here's the goals, and let's measure all the time. There needs to be space for that human connection to happen. And to your question of accessibility, I think that we have more and more people that are willing to give back. I think as institutions, we have a duty to make mentoring opportunities much more accessible, but also ensure that those relationships are built on this understanding that the learning happens both ways. And I believe that as we have generations of mentees that understand the importance of a balanced, open mentoring, they will in turn become mentors in the future, and it becomes a virtuous cycle. And I think we can see how that has evolved. You know, if we look back at, for instance, how yesterday we were at the Louvre and they were telling us how academies would have Monet's paintings be banned from being exposed because there was the very strong rules. Well, we still have some of these things happening these days, but I think we're in societies where in art we're much more open. We allow things, free thinking to happen. And so this is a time of information. This is a time of opening. And I do think that there's a shift from the times that you were describing, where access to mentors was much more limited versus now. Quick anecdote, I remember having a mentee come to my studio, wanting to become a rapper, become famous like many want. And we worked on a song, we focused on the music, and I remember being at a meeting in the United States and meeting with somebody from Spotify. And we were at a meeting, we took a picture, and the picture went on social media, and this artist that had never really traveled, when I go back to Mexico, he sees the picture and he says, "Oh, you know Anna from Spotify." I'm like, "How do you know Anna?" And he's like, "Well, I recognized that she worked in that company. I reached out through Instagram and she playlisted me because she really liked my music," right? That wasn't possible, 20, 30 years ago. And I think, there's a lot to be said for that as well. The fact that accessibility to people happens in many ways, not just within the frameworks of our institutions. And that certainly has changed, and I think will continue to change the landscape of that relationship between mentors and mentees.
I think when you walk into a situation,
Yeah.
So you're either the person with the money or you're the person with the experience, right? And you have this ridiculous power over the situation, right? And you've got the potential to literally stop a process from moving forward. So like in our studio, we've got a record company as well. When I walk in and the producer's been working on something for a long, long time, I walk in with the attitude of, how can I approve this? How can I say yes to this thing? As opposed to, how can I get in the way of this thing? And we just so need to be so very careful that in every single way we are allowing stuff. The answer should always be yes. We can even when we're trying to improve stuff, just make sure that we're getting out of the way of stuff. Like I know one of the questions earlier on also was like, will IDA replace us? IDA will never replace us.
No.
I think that when I think about the times that I've gone into a situation, and so AI generates all this wonderful art, right? And wins this amazing competition. But here we are as humans learning from that as well, right? And when they're like, "Oh, so robot friend did that, I'm going to see what I can do to take this thing one step further," right? We should never be scared that either mentors or the things that we've created are going to come and replace us. They will challenge us, but challenging us is good.
Right.
Eric, I'm going to stop you there because we've got a few minutes left, and I just want to know if anybody wants to ask a question from the audience. We will have a roving mic.
Good afternoon. My name's John. I'm a digital learning specialist. Thank you. This has been incredibly insightful and interesting. I guess my question to the panel is, we talked a lot about poverty and the barriers that causes. One of the things that I find is that makes your world very small. And one of the things that I think we've seen out of the pandemic is that distance can now be traversed instantaneously with minimal investment. So we're talking a lot about how we would mentor in a domestic sense, but I really would be interested to hear what the panel thinks about mentoring in an international sense. We have 3 continents represented here, and what you think you could give to people from other parts of the world.
Mentoring in an international sense at long distance means having access to the kit, first of all, that can let you do that.
For sure.
Right.
I thought, just some examples actually. We, in Central, we're running a programme just during the pandemic called Transforming Narratives, which was a collaborative exchange programme between Pakistan, Bangladesh and Birmingham. And what was really interesting is obviously the pandemic, it was supposed to be a physical exchange programme and collaborations. During the pandemic, that could no longer happen, and it didn't happen until the end of that programme. But what we found through that and being able to connect online internationally was a massively increased parity, actually, of being able to engage. So we transformed our programme into an international collaboration that was online, creating artworks together between all of these different countries. And I think, actually, it's, yes, this challenge around who has that digital connectivity, but it was also easier to see how the travel wasn't a barrier for them to engage with the work and with each other as well. So I think the pandemic actually made that programme much more successful. It culminated in a festival that was online and live streamed across all 3 countries, and profiling and showcasing those artists from all of those places. So,
Did you find, so I work a lot with book festivals, and one of the things that we found moving book festivals online is that the stage where you talk for a book festival or talk to a mentee is there's an enormous amount of empathy, and the moment that is mediated by the screen, it's very hard. It's much harder to put your hand out to another person. So making that human connection that you're talking about actually isn't so easy.
completely agree. But also, I think the way in which you set up that structure and the way, as part of the forum, we had these ALAP conversations, which were kind of follow-on conversations, which were those interactions with those people kind of looking and the audience able to kind of engage with it. So there is definitely barriers, and I think there are benefits to both, but I do think the digital can help that international collaboration and mentoring. In fact, I was talking to somebody earlier about how we might be able to do some of that online.
We've got a couple of minutes left. Have we got any more takers? Gentlemen here.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to reciprocate a question. Eric Wainaina is a fellow Kenyan. He asked me a question when I was on the panel. So I just want to put him under the spot as well. Nothing but love, brother. My question relates to sort of negative mentorship, and I think that was touched on, and the capacity for it to cause such immense evil in the world, with good intentions. In Kenya and a lot of African countries, global South countries, arguably have been malaised by sort of this immense corruption narrative, and this culture of corruption deeply seemed to be situated within a sort of African context. And naturally, the origin of this deeper corruption has its roots, beyond the global South setting. It has a sort of wider, sort of imperial and colonial setting. Now, my question in a roundabout way, how do you navigate that as a mentor, especially a mentor within the global South context, where a lot of what you say sometimes is, there's condescension. Do we really have mentors in the global South? How relevant are they? And I think it's a very problematic space with sort of grading mentorship within the context, whose value is added within that space of bad mentorship. And I think for us in Kenya, it's so prevalent. And I just wanted to pick your brain about how you give pushback to that in the mentorship space, where a lot of the youth are really confronting that. Thank you.
That's such a multi-layered question. I'm going to just try and pick at points of it as we go. So yesterday, and I said to the woman that I was sitting at dinner with that I was going to quote her verbatim. And she said, her name is Najla and she works for the Ministry of Culture here, and I'm now a convert. She said, if people aren't telling their own stories, right, then you allow the rest of the world to tell your story for you, right? And you walk into a situation where you're already feeling like a second-class citizen of the world, third-class citizen of the world. And in so many ways, Africa has had its story told for it. And it can't be like that anymore. We've got to be the ones telling our story. I mean, even to the point where, like, as a musician in Kenya, I'm having to deal with, and I love Nigerian music. I just want to put that out there first of all, right? But it's just like, you'll go into a club and Kenyans will be like, no, we don't want to hear that Kenyan music. Play some Nigerian music, right? And why? It's because Nigerians are making great music, but they're making a lot of it, and also we're letting them tell us what African music should sound like. And this is in no way a criticism of Nigerian music and Nigerian brothers and sisters in the audience. I love you to death, right? And so we've got to be, in every way, telling our story. It's gonna, it'll center us in our own story and center us in the way that we interact with the rest of the world, right? And so suddenly we're going to be on level playing field with everybody else, right? And I will feel like I've got something to say when I walk into a panel like this, and they're like, I'm from Kenya, but I have a great story, I have a lot to tell you, right? As opposed to feeling like I'm approaching this on the back foot.
I'm going to have to stop you there because I'm afraid we've run out of time. I'm not sure that's entirely answers your question, but Kenyans, we talk all the time. We can take this offline. Thank you so much, everybody. I think our big takeout here is we have to be more open. We have to learn. We have to listen to our younger generations. Their eyes are on us. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.
See you in the next session.